This is the Waupaca Area Public Library's Lunch and Learn.
Today we have our historian, our favorite historian, Dick Campbell, and he's going to talk with us about remembering Pearl Harbor.
Well, good afternoon. Good to be back here with you. For those who might be new to this activity today, I'm Dick Campbell from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and it's been my pleasure to share stories with the Lunch and Learn program here at the Waupaca Library for a number of years now. Because since 1999, I have now created a variety of 12 history presentations. And now I'd like to share one of these stories with you entitled Remembering Pearl Harbor. Starting with this quote from 75 years ago. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. With this opening sentence, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, appearing before a joint session of Congress on December 8, terms the attack by Japan upon Hawaii as dastardly and unprovoked, and asks for an immediate declaration of war. He closed his text remarks with this sentence: with confidence in our armed forces and with the unbounding and determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. Roosevelt had spoken only 6½ minutes. In American mythology, Pearl Harbor still represents, even after 75 years, a classical moment of treachery and betrayal. Certainly it was a moment of historic surprise, a moment when the impossible happened, when warfare suddenly spread for the first and only time in history to virtually the whole world. The surprise when it first exploded over Pearl Harbor was shattering. And anyone now over 82 years old can probably still remember what they were doing when the news erupted that quiet Sunday. My remembrance of that day was recorded in this December 2007 issue of the History Channel magazine, which I subscribe to, shown here on page 40 of this issue of that magazine. A few months before, they had asked subscribers to answer the question, where were you on Infamy's day? Well, I was 9 years old, living in Indianapolis, Indiana, sitting on our front porch. I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was at the time, but I became very interested in following the progress of our involvement in World War II through radio reports and news coverage in our 3 Indianapolis newspapers. And on December 8, 1941, I began clipping anything pertaining to the war for the next 4 years. And by September 2, 1945, I had compiled 8 scrapbooks, which I still have today. I like to refer to them as World War II through the eyes of a Hoosier boy, being from Indiana. And my mother never threw anything out. So I have 2 of those issues I brought along with me, numbers 1 and 8, over on my resource table to my right here. And number 1, I was 9 years old, and number 8 would have been, I was about 13 years old when I finished up with that 8th book. Looking back after 75 years, it's difficult to imagine how so many clues were missed or ignored, and also somewhat difficult to understand why Japan attacked in the first place. The causes of the war were complex. When Japanese troops landed in French Indochina in 1941, President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States and cut off Japan's critical supplies of oil from the United States. To Japanese leaders, his actions threatened the very survival of their nation, which they believed depended upon further expansion into Southeast Asia. The Japanese military set its sights on British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, a U.S. Commonwealth. Without abundant new supplies of tin, rubber, oil, and other resources found in these countries, Japan feared it could not fulfill its destiny to rule Asia. War now appeared inevitable between Japan and the U.S. For years, the U.S. ambassador to Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, had warned of the temper of the Japanese military. Yet the daring plan to bomb Pearl Harbor came not from a young warrior itching to fight, but rather from a 57-year-old Japanese veteran in January 1941 who was deeply opposed to war with America, Admiral Ichiroko Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University in 1919, and he served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C. from 1926 to 1928. And having witnessed America's industrial strength and vast resources, Yamamoto doubted Japan's chances for ultimate victory. Although initially opposed to war with the United States, he resigned himself to war under pressure from the army-ruled Japanese government and its expansionist plans. The purpose of the attack was to sink or cripple large units of the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that they would not interfere with Japan's southern thrust towards the Philippines, and especially the East Indies, with its strategic supplies of oil, rubber, and other resources. Denied oil by the United States, Japan needed an alternate source for her undeclared war with China. Once Yamamoto was convinced that war was unavoidable, he reached a startling conclusion. Instead of waiting for U.S. ships to venture close to Japanese waters where the Japanese Navy could fight a defensive battle, Japan should launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to deliver an early knockout punch. If Japan could destroy the U.S. fleet in one preemptive strike, it could set up an impenetrable line of defense across the Pacific Ocean before America could replenish its warship supply. And by then it would be too late for the U.S. to challenge Japan's conquest of Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Even as the Japanese prepared for war, however, American leaders seemed blind to the approaching danger, suffering from what one Pearl Harbor veteran described as, quote, the supreme overconfidence of a great athlete, unquote. The island of Oahu, due to its fortifications, its garrison, and its physical characteristics at Pearl Harbor, was believed to be the strongest fortress in the world. One U.S. senator boasted that the U.S. Navy, quote, can defeat the Japanese Navy any place at any time, unquote. Even President Roosevelt and his top advisors, who were reading Tokyo's secret diplomatic messages, failed to recognize the imminent danger to Hawaii. The two officers most responsible for defending Pearl Harbor were caught equally unprepared for the assault. The Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, was convinced that Japan would strike in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Even after an urgent war warning message to Pacific bases from Washington, D.C. on November 27, 1941, stating that, quote, an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days, unquote. Kimmel took no special precautions at Pearl Harbor. No ships were sent out to sea, no long-range patrols ordered for Navy scout planes. The commander of the Army's Hawaiian Department, Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, was more worried about sabotage by Hawaii's 160,000 residents of Japanese ancestry than about a surprise attack by Japan. When Short read the war warning message on November 27, he ordered an alert calling for a defense against sabotage, espionage, and subversive activities. Instead of taking measures to ensure that his warplanes could respond swiftly to an attack, he ordered ammunition to be locked up to prevent theft by locals, and his aircraft parked in tight groups out in the open, where they could be easily protected from saboteurs. And as a result, they were lined up like sitting ducks when the Japanese bombers swooped in. To be fair, Hawaii's military leaders might have defended Pearl Harbor better if America's intelligence agencies had been more alert and had passed along crucial information sooner. Only a few weeks after Yamamoto began discussing Operation Hawaii with other Japanese naval officers, Ambassador Grew picked up an alarming rumor in Tokyo that the Japanese military forces planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Division of Naval Intelligence placed no credence on these rumors and said, quote, no move against Pearl Harbor appeared imminent or planned for in the foreseeable future, unquote. The rumor was forgotten. Although the U.S. had broken the codes for Japanese diplomatic messages in the summer of 1940, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were not getting information they needed. Among the documents flooding cryptographers in Washington were cables from 29-year-old Takeo Yoshikawa, a spy in the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. He had regularly posed as a tourist in a bright Aloha shirt, taking commercial sightseeing flights over Oahu and Pearl Harbor, and then reporting back to Tokyo the number and types of warships in the harbor. As December 7 approached, Yoshikawa's handlers in Tokyo stepped up their questions to him about the harbor. How long did the U.S. warships remain at anchor? On what day of the week would there be the most ships in the harbor? Did the battleships have torpedo nests? Were there any observation balloons over Pearl Harbor? Because Yoshikawa was never identified as a spy, his reports were ignored by intelligence experts in Washington. In Yoshikawa's next to last cable to Japan, on December 6th, he concluded with this coded message, quote, I imagine that in all probability there is considerable opportunity left to take advantage for surprise attack against these places, end quote. Intercepted by U.S. intelligence like the others from Yoshikawa, this cable was not given priority for decoding. and it sat in a pile of unread messages until Monday afternoon, December 8th. Yet another chance to sound the alert came at 6:45 a.m. Sunday morning, when the destroyer Ward spotted and fired upon a midget submarine at 6:53 a.m. near the entrance to the Pearl Harbor Channel. This vessel was one of 5 midget and 30 large submarines then encircling Oahu. Their mission was to spy on the base, torpedo any escaping ships, and protect the Japanese aircraft carriers. The Ward's captain reported his action to the district watch officer, radioing that, quote, "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area," end quote. But the urgency of the message was lost as the duty officer relayed the report to a second watch officer, who was delayed by busy signals in telephoning a third officer, who called Admiral Kimmel at home. And having recently dealt with numerous false alarms relating to submarines in the area, Admiral Kimmel reacted skeptically, deciding to, quote, "wait for verification," end quote. And by that time, the Japanese bombers were on their way. Incredibly, the Japanese aircraft were spotted by 2 U.S. Army radar operators at 7:02 a.m., while the planes were still more than 130 miles away. Even that wasn't enough to rouse Pearl Harbor into action. Private Joseph Lockhart had been training Private George Elliott, both pictured here, on the Opana Mobile Radar Unit above Kahuka Point on Oahu's northern coast, when the pair saw an enormous blip on the radar screen, bigger than any Lockhart had ever seen before, probably more than 50 planes. And according to General Short's directives, though, they were supposed to have turned their radar set off at 7 a.m. at the end of their daily 3-hour watch. But the breakfast pickup truck had been late, so they decided to keep the radar unit on. Lockhart telephoned the information center at Fort Schafter, which passed the message along to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, a pilot with the 78th Pursuit Squadron, who was temporarily manning the message desk. At 7:20 a.m., Lockhart told Tyler that they were continuing to track what appeared to be an unusually large flight racing in from almost due north. Remembering that a flight of B-17 American bombers was due to arrive from California that morning, Tyler told Lockhart, quote, "Well, don't worry about it," end quote. 5 words that he regretted for the rest of his life. Elliott and Lockhart continued to plot the incoming Japanese planes until 7:40 a.m. Then, contact was lost in the background interference as the planes approached Pearl Harbor. Both men then secured the Opana radar site and headed down for breakfast. The bombing began at 7:55 a.m., December 7, 1941. The Japanese task force, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and his flagship, the Akagi, had steamed eastward from Hitakubo Bay in the Curlies on November 26, 1941, for its 12-day voyage to Hawaii. This task force, 2 aircraft carriers pictured here, consisted of 6 aircraft carriers with 432 aircraft aboard, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 7 refueling tankers. for a total of 30 ships. At an average speed of 13 knots, refueling daily, the attack force pursued a course 3,150 miles from Hitakubo Bay through the empty expanse of the North Pacific, arriving at their takeoff point about 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor on December 6th, Saturday. At 5:50 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Admiral Nagumo turned his 6 carriers into the wind and increased their speed to 24 knots. The flight decks tilted more than 10 degrees. Wind whipped ocean spray over them. At 6:10 a.m. on the Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the air attack, took off in a Kate bomber with the first wave of Zero fighters, followed by the dive bombers, high-level bombers, and torpedo planes. Within 15 minutes, 183 aircraft are winging south toward Oahu. Another 167 planes will follow in the second wave. Fuchida's aircraft had to fly blind over dense banks of clouds. So he homed in on the Honolulu commercial radio station, KGMV. And over his receiver, Fuchida heard soft music. Then a weather report. Quote, partly cloudy over the mountains, cloud base at 3,500 feet. Visibility good, end quote. Fuchida flew on. Here's a good picture of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, with the Ford Island Naval Air Station in the middle and the position of the battleships on the northeast side. The small insert map shows the flight paths of each of the waves during their attack. When Fuchida arrived over Pearl Harbor, he thought to himself, quote, what a majestic sight, end quote, as he counted the vessels lined up in Battleship Row in the dawn's early light. 8 of the 9 battleships in the Pacific Fleet were enjoying a quiet day of rest. A total of 96 ships were in the harbor. Fuchida fired a flare at 7:40 a.m. from his plane to start the attack. He then sent the now famous radio message to all Japanese commanders in the Pacific, Tora, 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 meaning tiger, 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 indicating that they had achieved complete surprise. And within minutes, Pearl Harbor was pandemonium. Explosions, screams, tearing steel, the rattle of machine guns, smoke, fire, bugles sounding, the whine of diving planes, and more explosions. With Battleship Row afire, Fuchida's bombers circled over the maze of Pearl Harbor's decks and piers, striking again and again at the cruisers and destroyers and supply ships harbored there. Other Japanese bombers swarmed over Hawaii's military airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Kanoe, and Iwa, dive bombing and strafing the American planes neatly parked on all the runways. They quickly won control of the sky. They wrecked hangars, warehouses, and barracks. Fuchida's surprise attack lasted only about 1/2 hour. Then after a short lull, the second wave of 167 planes roared in at 8:40 a.m. And by this time, the Americans in the harbor were on the alert and firing at anything in sight. Unfortunately, 20 planes from our aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, which was returning to Pearl Harbor that morning from Wake Island, came under heavy American ground fire, and 2 of their planes were accidentally shot down. In the next 10 slides, you'll see some of the major warship casualties from the 2 Pearl Harbor attacks by the Japanese bombers. Several of these photos are from my 1941-42 scrapbook, off to my right here. The Arizona was a total loss, but today is kept sentimentally in commission and is graced by a memorial to all the war dead of that Sunday morning. One of the classic pictures of the Pearl Harbor attack from left are battleships West Virginia, Tennessee, and Arizona. Smoke blankets bomb-ravaged West Virginia and Tennessee in ruins of Pearl Harbor's Battleship Row. The West Virginia was struck by 2 bombs and 6 torpedoes. 105 seamen lost their lives. The California, struck by 2 torpedoes and 1 bomb, struggles to stay afloat. The ship sank over a period of 3 days. The battleship Nevada, only ship of her class to get underway during the attack, deliberately runs aground to avoid the possibility of sinking and blocking the channel entrance. The Oklahoma never had a chance. Within 3 minutes after bombs began exploding on Ford Island, 3 torpedoes blasted huge holes in the ship, and she immediately began listing heavily. 2 more torpedo hits caused her to completely roll over within 15 minutes of the start of the attack. Oklahoma lost 416 officers and men. Japanese bombs made accurate use of the Utah, a 33-year-old target ship. Here she is bottoms up in the harbor. This is one of the most remarkable pictures of the war. It depicts the blowing up of the magazine of the USS Shaw, a destroyer. It's shown on fire following direct hits by 3 bombs, one of which severed her bow forward of the bridge. The Downs and the caisson are pictured here, heavily damaged in dry dock, with the battleship Pennsylvania behind the 2 destroyers. In this photo, captured Japanese film shows the burning ships along Japanese row during the attacks. More fortunate for our side were 2 U.S. Army pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, who on Saturday night had gone from a dance at the Wheeler Officers Club to an all-night poker game. They were still in formal dress at 8 a.m. when they saw the first Japanese planes open fire overhead. Under strafing fire, Taylor's car raced back to their P-40 fighter aircraft at Halewa Field. Taking off, the 2 went looking for Japanese planes and soon found them over Wheeler Field, where the 2 sleepless lieutenants shot down several planes. Official records credit the 2 of them with downing 7 Japanese planes, almost 1/4 of all the Japanese losses. The great attack was really fairly short. The first bombers returned to their carriers just after 10 a.m., scarcely 2 hours after they descended on Battleship Row. Fushida lingered to observe and photograph the damage and was the last to return to Nagumo's fleet. It was still only noon. Mitsuo Fushida and Minoru Genda argued fiercely with Nagumo for renewing the attack. But Admiral Nagumo, who had mistrusted the plan from the start, felt he had accomplished his mission and saw no reason to risk his fleet any further. Back in Japan, Yamamoto strongly disapproved of Nagumo's decision to withdraw, but accepted the tradition that such decisions are left to the combat commander on the scene. In terms of casual destruction, this was the most one-sided battle in history. The U.S. lost 2,403 killed, about half of them on the Arizona, shown here. and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese, who had expected to sacrifice as much as 1/3 of their force, lost 55 airmen, 9 crewmen aboard 5 mini-subs, and approximately 65 on 1 sunken large submarine. The U.S. lost 21 surface warships, sunk or seriously damaged. The Japanese, none. The U.S. lost 169 planes destroyed and 159 damaged. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft. To Yamamoto and the Imperial Japanese Navy, Operation Hawaii appeared to be a complete success. Through diligent training, innovative weapon designs, bold strategy, and fearless execution, Japan gained the upper hand during the first month of the war. But they also made some big blunders at Pearl Harbor. They failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard, which within months repaired 3 battleships and sent them back to sea. Had our Pearl Harbor installations for repairs been destroyed, our fleet would have been forced back to the west coast of the United States for support. Another item which would have prolonged the war. They failed to blow up the oil storage tanks, brimming with 190 million gallons of fuel. Without that fuel, the U.S. fleet would have had to relocate to the mainland. And had our oil supply been destroyed, it would have taken years to reestablish that supply and would have delayed our Pacific War accordingly. They failed to catch the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers that were in port, the Lexington and Enterprise. They failed to catch the carriers in port because the Lexington and Enterprise were at sea. And the Saratoga, pictured here, was undergoing repairs in California. And within 6 months, the carriers struck back, sinking 4 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. Likewise, the Japanese made an even more serious error on December 7 by leaving our submarine base at power-Pointe free from attack. As a consequence, no submarines or supporting equipment were damaged, and submarines could proceed immediately to stations in the far western Pacific and start their long campaign of destruction of the Japanese merchant marine, which was a primary factor in the defeat of Japan. So, in spite of the reverses we suffered on December 7th, there were some spots on which we could congratulate ourselves on our good luck. There was further cause for rejoicing in the fact that the Japanese had made the attack on our fleet while it was inside Pearl Harbor. Had the fleet been at sea, Admiral Kimmel would certainly have tried to force a battle to bring into play the powerful armament that our battleships carried. However, these ships would have been limited to a maximum speed of about 18 knots, while the Japanese task force had a fleet speed of 22 knots. This difference in speed would have imposed a tremendous disadvantage to the U.S. fleet at that time. Furthermore, the Japanese task force that came to Pearl Harbor that day had 6 aircraft carriers, where we had none. Imagine, if you can, what would have happened to our slower battleships in an open sea action, with aircraft of 6 aircraft carriers working on them, and with our fleet having no air cover at all. Remember that on December 7, the Japanese destroyed all the aviation strength of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps on Oahu. Instead of losing some 2,400 men, as we did, Pearl Harbor, we would or could possibly have lost by drowning or capture almost 20,000 men had our fleet been at sea in deep water. Most important for Japan, Yamamoto had misjudged the United States. Instead of being demoralized by the surprise attack as he had predicted, the American people were enraged. No matter what their political differences, they were now united in their determination to seek revenge. No longer did President Roosevelt have to persuade the U.S. to join the world at war. When the Japanese bombers struck on that awful Sunday morning, they gave Americans all the reasons they needed. The Pearl Harbor story touches all Americans with tales of bravery, treachery, heroism, disaster, and sacrifice. Against a backdrop of sweeping historical forces, ordinary men and women were caught up in extraordinary events. No matter how the story is told, the attack upon Pearl Harbor will always resonate in the hearts of Americans, who will never forget the courage of those who died or the importance of remembering why. Today, the submerged Arizona is the centerpiece of the Pearl Harbor Memorial. If you look closely, you can make out the ghostly shape of the sunken battleship beneath the memorial and a shimmering trail of oil that some say is the tears of the 1,177 crewmen who died here. All but 229 whose bodies were recovered in the days after the attack remain entombed in the ship. As a point of interest, there were 36 sets of brothers and one father-son on board the Arizona, of which 24 sets died during the ship's explosion and sinking, along with the father and son. Like a bridge spanning the years, the Arizona Memorial has become a place of reconciliation as well as remembrance. Of the 96 U.S. warship in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, 21 were sunk or damaged. Of the 9 battleships, all supposedly destroyed, 6 were successfully refloated, salvaged, and returned to active service in 1942, thanks to the preservation of the Navy Yard from Japanese attack. Here's what happened to all of these battleships. In addition to the Arizona, the Utah remains where she was sunk, with 58 men still entombed inside. She was the first ship attacked by Japanese planes, and was hit by 2 torpedoes, and within 7 minutes she had capsized. Only 1 man was rescued. A memorial to her was constructed on Ford Island in 1972. The Oklahoma was finally turned over and refloated in 1943, and then stripped of her guns, ammunition, and machinery, and decommissioned in 1944. She then was sold for scrap in 1946, and while being towed to the West Coast, she began taking in water and sank into the Pacific Ocean. The California was completely rebuilt and modernized in 1942 and sailed for the South Pacific, ready for active duty with the U.S. fleet, where she received 7 battle stars for her service. The West Virginia was refloated and modernized in 1942 and returned to service in 1944. She was the only ship from the Pearl Harbor attack to be present in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, for the signing of the formal Japanese surrender documents. The Tennessee was moved to the Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor for minor repairs and ultimately to the West Coast in 1942 for permanent repairs and major modernization. She then participated in many major battles in the South Pacific and received 10 battle stars. The Pennsylvania received minor damage, and after sailing to San Francisco to complete repairs, was ready for service in March of 1942. She was awarded 8 battle stars for her service. The Maryland sustained minimal damage due to her position inboard of the Oklahoma, and she returned to the fleet on February 1942 and was fully modernized in 1944. The Nevada was refloated and modernized in May 1942 and rejoined the Pacific Fleet in December of 1942. She then took part in the Aleutian Campaign, the Normandy D-Day landings, Okinawa Campaign, and closed out her career as a target ship in the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb test of 1946. And finally, only 2 of the 30 Japanese surface ships of Admiral Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor Task Force survived the fighting in the Pacific War Theater. All 6 aircraft carriers that delivered their bombers to the Pearl Harbor target area were sunk by the end of the war. 4 of them at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. In closing, here's a 1998 picture of the USS Arizona Memorial being joined by the USS Missouri battleship side by side in Pearl Harbor, representing the beginning and ending of the United States in World War II. And here's an historic photo of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signing the Japanese surrender document aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, surrounded by many American officers. And now you know the rest of the story, and I thank you very much for your interest in this great moment in history. Thank you. Any questions or comments? I'll do my best to try to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
So, at the beginning of the war, Japan was short of oil, correct?
I'm sorry. Let me come out here.
At the beginning of the war, Japan was short on oil?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we had shut off our supply to Japan earlier.
So was there ever any theory that they left those oil reserves, that they didn't touch those when they, on Pearl Harbor?
Well, those 2 pilots wanted to go for the 3rd wave. That was planned to get the things that were mentioned that were saved. But Admiral Nagumo said, no, we're going home. Fortunately for us, that's why.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people are aware of that, that they could. And we were waiting for an invasion. Hawaii, that night of December 7th, December 8th, people on the islands were gearing up for an invasion. And if the Japanese had had troop ships ready to attack, which would have been a big thing, could go over 3,000 miles. That would almost have been an impossibility. They possibly could have been, I think, invaded Hawaii successfully. Fortunately, they didn't plan on doing that. Yes?
There were supposed to be 5 mini submarines that were,
Yes.
4 of them were accounted for. Have they accounted for the 5th one?
It's
How do you
some.
know there was 5 then?
There were 5, and they captured, one of them washed up on the shore, and they captured, that was the first Japanese prisoner of World War II. And ideally, they were supposed to have committed suicide. Any of those submariners were not supposed to be captured. And he regretted that, as I understand in my reading of that incident. but all of the 5 were destroyed. And, so there were 2 Japanese military men on each of those missiles. So 9 out of the 10 died, and we captured 1 of them. Yeah.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Didn't the United States gather all the Japanese citizens in the United States and put them in a special camp?
They were interned, yes, sir. All over the western and midwestern United States. Yeah. Western, quite a bit on the western side. There were as I mentioned, there were 160,000 of Japanese ancestry on Hawaii at the time of the attack, who were not enemies to us. That's not one of our best things we did.
No.
Was that internments of the Japanese citizens from Hawaii. But we were scared of what was going to happen.
Did our leadership let this happen on purpose?
No, sir.
Because they wanted to go to war?
Not as far as I'm concerned, no. There's a lot of pros and cons about that. Did Roosevelt know that Roosevelt? Probably a lot depends on who you read about that. But as far as my own personal belief is no. That was not the intent of letting Japan come as they did. Yes,
For
sir.
your knowledge, I read there at Camp McCoy, they had a lot of POWs, and the guy on this midget submarine, was he detained there in Camp McCoy? Is that true?
The Japanese submarine?
He was the one that was captured.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know. I
read
don't
that.
know. I'm not aware of that. Could be.
POWs of Camp McCoy.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know, sir,
Yeah.
if that's true, or where he was taken. But he did survive. I don't know how long he lived after that or not.
They didn't want to
But at
work.
Camp McCoy,
Yeah.
Not German.
well, as we kids at home, we'll probably have to Google that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know. Somebody had a question over here.
Not anymore?
I'm sorry.
Well, I was gonna.
Here
she.
Okay.
So there were no internment camps in Hawaii, is that what you said?
I don't think so. I think they shipped them all into the United States. It could be wrong. They possibly could be. That's another thing to Google. Would be. But I didn't realize that there were that many citizens of Japanese ancestry that were in Hawaii in December of 1941. That was a heavy part of the population. Some of the biggest visitors to Pearl. How many of you have visited the memorial? I would think there'd be quite a few in this group. And you probably saw, I visited there one time, a number of years ago. And it's amazing the number of people from Japan who come to visit that memorial. And I understand still all of you probably noticed this when you were there. Yes?
We had a program at Winchester recently about the war continuing in the Philippines.
Mhm.
And she stressed the part women played.
Mhm.
And I'm ashamed to say I had never thought about the war that continued in the Philippines.
Oh, yeah,
And
that was went on till about May of 1942 until we had to surrender. But you've heard of Pean,
yes, but
Ecuador,
I didn't realize that's
Yes.
where it, I thought there
the
was
Philippines.
Japanese.
That was a terrible part of the Pean
Yeah,
death
one
march.
of the worst, of the war.
Yeah, terrible part of our history. Anything else? Yes, sir.
We used to, having been over there in the service, we had some of these Japanese fellows that worked for us. I always used to tell them, Tojo eats horse manure with a dirty spoon. He said, no, he used chopsticks. Tradition.
Anything else?
Question.
Thank,
When did
yes.
the country release people from the internment camps?
Pardon?
When did our country release people that were in the internment camps, do you know?
I think it was before the war ended, we were starting to let some go. But not right away, as far as I knew. They were not treated real well. And they were,
My Swedish nephew's wife, his parents were interred in Colorado. He was a professor of chemistry in New England and of Japanese origin, and his wife was English, an English woman, and they were interred in Colorado.
well, they were guilty right away.
Right.
Anything else?
Sure.
Yes?
There were 3 brothers from New London on the Arizona, the Barber Boys, 3 of them.
3 brothers in Arizona. And
I'm so old, I
none
remember all
survived.
this stuff when it happened, you know, and everything.
Really, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
One of the, it
And
brings
there
to
were the-
mind the
There were the Sullivan brothers on another.
The Sullivan brothers, I was just gonna say, it brings to mind the tragic death of 5 Sullivan brothers on the ship named the Juno down in the battle at Guadalcanal, late 42. And also that I read when there was another 5 brothers on that same ship, the Juno, and I don't remember what their names were. And from then they weren't allowed
They
to,
stopped doing it, yeah.
they weren't allowed to be all in the same assignment after that terrible
My
event.
brother was there and got out the day before they were
Oh,
bombed.
really?
And my parents thought he was on one of the ships.
Oh, really? Oh, my goodness.
It's the first time I ever saw my father cry.
That was a terrible time.
Yeah.
Terrible time.
Do you know whatever happened to the man that was in Hawaii at the time and was sending reports?
Yashikawa?
I don't know what his name was, but
Takeo Yashikawa. What happened to him? I think he got back to Tokyo. I think. That's something I'm gonna have to look at. The aftermath of that.
you know, it's amazing that we didn't catch that.
I know.
It just doesn't.
Can I ask anybody remember Pearl Harbor? I was 9. I'll be 85 this year.
Same age as you are.
What do you remember? Do we have time?
I remember a neighbor,
Pardon?
a neighbor we had, his name was Raymond Pipe. He was listening to the Packer game, and they come on and announced that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And then that was on Sunday, and the next Monday, the next day, we were at Pipe School. That's a one-room schoolhouse. And we all went over to Pipe's house and listened to President Roosevelt declare war on Japan.
And how old were you, if I may ask?
9, I'm the same age
You were
as you are.
1930. That was a good year. Who else remember?
I'm 91, and so I remember all these things. And my brother was on the Flag Commander battleship during the war, and he was in intelligence in Hawaii, and he thought the Japanese were getting too cozy with Roosevelt.
Really?
Yeah.
But you remember. And you were living where, if I may?
In New London.
Where?
New London.
New London.
Mhm.
Another thing that we were such isolationists at that time, it was hard to get goods up to Canada to get it shipped to Europe, because I remember we were at the 4-H clubs, we had sang the song, I don't want to march in the infantry, I don't want to fly over Germany, I just want to be friendly. And we sang that at the 4-H club. We were isolationists, and I always felt after being in Japan on occupation that it was good that they kicked us in the pants and let us know, let's go. Because we sang that song, and after that day, they didn't sing it no more.
Who wrote that song? You didn't write that song.
I didn't write it, I was 9 years old.
I was 10, and I remember it, but we complained about everything being so political, it always was, but it was an innocence. We had an innocence of it. I remember it as the day, it happened on Sunday, and I had to, my grandma stopped playing checkers, and I was so glad, because I hated playing checkers. But I sensed how serious it was from my parents, but I thought, well, we're always at war, aren't we? Because of my history. You know, what do you teach in history? War. But the big deal was on that Monday, well, we brought at school, our classes were interrupted, but we listened to the broadcast of the president.
Remember that.
Declaring war, and it was, that was a solemn occasion. Our you know, it was, that's my memory. But I sensed it more from my parents than from the adults about how serious this was.
Anybody else that has a good memory? Yes, sir.
I was only 5.
Well, you remember. What were you doing?
I went to school the next day and they sent me home.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't remember.
Did they tell you why?
Well, they did, but I had it all mixed up by the time.
Was it snowing outside? I'm not, where, you live here in Wisconsin
I was
then?
in Maine.
Oh, you were in Maine? So
I
it could have been
don't think we
snowing
had
there.
radios back then.
They sent you home, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't believe how fast they've got those ships going. I mean, how did they ever do that?
Isn't that amazing?
I mean,
That surprised me when I put this program together. I didn't totally remember that they did that so quickly. You know, I thought they were all destroyed. Oh, we recovered. Well, that's why we won the war. We just started building ships and aircraft carriers and everything, and almost right away. Quit building cars, changed Detroit into building, Dearborn building B-24 bombers.
Women worked. Yeah, women worked.
That was my mother was Rosie.
Yep. No, that's, thank you.